Hey, come on in. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Get under the blanket and let your eyes go soft. You don't have to do anything tonight except listen. We're going into the land of Ooh, and we're going in through the back door, through the part of the show that never quite got answered, the part that the writers left open on purpose or left open because they ran out of time. And either way, it's still open, and we're going to walk through every single one of those open doors tonight, one at a time, slowly, all the way down. Adventure Time spent 10 seasons and a small library of comics and specials, building one of the most quietly enormous mythologies in the history of children's television. And the strange thing about a mythology that big is that it can't help leaving gaps. Some shows paper over their gaps. Adventure Time let them stand. It built a world so confident in its own texture that it could leave a mystery sitting in the middle of an episode, unresolved, and trust you to keep carrying it around in your chest for years afterward without ever needing it tied off in a bow. Tonight, we are going to go looking for every one of those gaps we can find. The mysteries the show solved late, the mysteries it solved halfway, and the mysteries it never solved at all, the ones that just sit there in the lore like stones at the bottom of a riverbed, smoothed by years of fan theorizing, but never picked up and explained outright by the people who made the show. We're going to start with the biggest one, the one underneath everything else, the one every other mystery in Ooh is in some sense a smaller piece of. And then we'll go from there into the personal mysteries, the cosmic mysteries, the mysteries that got answered just enough to feel like a tease, and the mysteries that the show seemed to forget about entirely, the loose threads that never got pulled again after the episode that introduced them. There's a lot of ground. The Mushroom War is the foundation of every mystery in Adventure Time because it's the mystery that all the others grow out of. We know certain things about it with real confidence because the show was willing to state them plainly, even while keeping the texture vague. It was, by the show's own internal logic, 1,000 years before the events of the series, and Marceline's flashback sequence in the episode Simon and Marcy gives an explicit timestamp on screen reading 996 years before the present, which is about as close to a hard date as the show ever offers. We also know because Simon Petrikov's exhibit placard in the episode Simon Petrikov labels him as a man from the 20th century, and because background details across dozens of episodes show old computers, highway signage, and corporate logos that are unmistakably contemporary to roughly our own moment in history, that the war did not happen in some distant, fantastical past. It happened to a world that looked like ours. A Generation 3 iMac computer appears in the episode The Lich, a model that became available to the public starting in 1998, which suggests the war happened sometime after that year. And in a detail that fans have pieced together with real patience, a surviving human named Two Bread Tom is shown singing the theme song to the sitcom Mr. Belvedere, which premiered in 1985, while in Simon and Marcy, the Ice King sings the theme to Cheers, which premiered in 1982, both of which support a setting somewhere in the final years of the 20th century or the opening years of the next one. This is speculative dating, pieced together from props and references the writers may not have intended as a precise timeline, but it's the dating that the show's own internal evidence supports most consistently, and it places the end of human civilization as we currently understand it disturbingly close to where we're sitting right now. What we do not know, what the show has never stated, what remains genuinely and deliberately unresolved after 10 seasons and several feature-length specials is why the war happened, who started it, what the actual political or ideological conflict was between the parties involved. The show gives us effects without causes. We know it was, in its own terminology, a nuclear war, hence the mushroom in the title, the unmistakable silhouette of a mushroom cloud that gives the conflict its name. We know that beyond the conventional nuclear exchange, there was something else, a specific weapon the show calls the mushroom bomb, which was not simply destructive in the ordinary sense, but mutagenic, meaning it altered the genetic and biological structure of the things it touched rather than only killing them. The series has confirmed that this bomb in particular awakened the Lich, mutated much of Earth's life, and brought about a resurgence of magic that had been in decline for most of human history, and that it was dropped on what was once North America. That much is canon, stated plainly within the show's own internal logic. But the political shape of the conflict, the leaders, the ideology, the spark that lit it, none of that has ever been given to us. The closest the show comes to a motive is a moment in a tie-in book where Simon Petrikov notes that there is an international conflict brewing between major world powers, a detail that may be hinting at the war's origins without confirming anything specific. Pendleton Ward, the show's creator, has said in interviews that the writers deliberately avoided building a full episode directly depicting the war itself, partly because the subject matter felt too heavy for the show's intended audience, and that choice, whether you read it as caution or as wisdom, left an enormous structural gap in the mythology that the show simply chose to leave open. We get archaeology instead of history. We get the broken stealth bomber resembling an F-117 Nighthawk visible in the background of Princess Bubblegum's origin flashback. We get rusted highway signs and half-buried military vehicles scattered through outdoor scenes across nearly every season. We get a poster glimpsed in a gas station ruin that simply reads, "Never forget," beneath an image of a mushroom cloud, a phrase borrowed wholesale from how real human societies memorialize their own catastrophes. What we never get is the why. The show built an entire civilization's worth of ruins, and never once let us read the news story explaining what happened the week before everything ended. That absence isn't a flaw in the writing. It's the entire emotional architecture of the show resting on top of it. A world built on a wound nobody can name has a different texture than a world built on a wound everyone understands, and Adventure Time chose, consistently, across its whole run, to live inside the first kind of world. There's a smaller, stranger mystery buried inside the larger one, which is the question of who, exactly, survived. The show gives us a short list of named individuals who lived through the war directly and carried memory of the old world forward into the new one. Marceline did, as a small child wandering through the rubble. Simon Petrikov did, kept alive past any natural human lifespan by the crown's slow-burning magic. Abraham Lincoln, in some form, survived as well, eventually becoming the King of Mars. One of the stranger pieces of trivia the show ever committed to its own canon, and a character named Mo survived as a cyborg. Beyond that handful, the show is vague, almost evasive, about how anyone else made it through, and vaguer still about what happened to civilization in the years immediately following. We're told, through a few scattered references, that the survivors scattered, that some went underground, that some mutated under the bomb's lingering effects into the candy people and slime creatures and shape-shifting beings that populate the land of Ooh by the time Finn and Jake come along. But the specific mechanics of that transition, how exactly a surviving human population becomes, within a handful of generations, an entire ecosystem of magical creatures with their own kingdoms and politics and history is never laid out as a continuous narrative. It happened off screen, in the dark, in the gap between Simon's video diaries and Princess Bubblegum's earliest flashbacks, and the show trusts you to accept the outcome without ever walking you through the process. Before we go further down, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely like to know. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching this from and what time it is where you are right now. I like knowing that people all over the world are lying in the dark together while Ooh plays out in front of them. It makes the world feel a little smaller and a little warmer, and that's sort of the whole point of a show like this one. Okay, let's keep going. If the Mushroom War is the mystery underneath everything, the Lich is the mystery that sits closest to the surface of the show's villainy. And even after the show gave him one of the most fully developed cosmological backstories of any character in the series, there's still a layer of him that resists being fully pinned down. We know, because the episode Gold Stars states it directly through the Lich's own monologue, that he describes himself as predating the universe itself, claiming that before the universe existed, there was nothing, and before there was nothing, there were monsters, of which he counts himself one. That's about as direct a piece of cosmology as the show ever gave us, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because it means the show's villain isn't simply ancient in the way a 1,000-year-old vampire is ancient. He's ancient in a category the show's own physics can't fully contain. We know his essence arrived on Earth carried inside, or as a green catalyst comet, the same comet implied to be connected to the extinction event that killed the dinosaurs in the prehistoric episode Evergreen. We know he took physical form near the end of the Mushroom War, possessing a person who had been submerged in the mutagenic fallout from the bomb, meaning the worst thing humanity ever did to itself, and the moment the Lich gained a body in the physical world are not two separate events in the show's mythology. They're the same event, viewed from two different angles. What remains genuinely unresolved, what the show gestures at without ever fully closing, is the question of what the Lich actually wants on a level deeper than the stated goal of ending all life. He says he serves an entity called Golb, that his purpose is devotional rather than personal, that the extinction of all living things is, in his own words, an offering rather than an act of malice. But the show never quite explains what Golb gets from that offering, what cosmic accounting makes the death of an entire universe a meaningful gift to a being who is themselves the embodiment of chaos rather than order. It's a theology without a fully worked out liturgy, and the show seems comfortable leaving it that way, the same way real religions often leave their deepest claims slightly underexplained, resting on faith rather than proof. The penguin sitting in the corner of the Ice King's palace turned out to be one of the most quietly enormous reveals in the show's run, and it's worth walking through carefully, because it's one of the rare mysteries the show actually closed almost completely. Gunter, one among many penguins the Ice King names indiscriminately, was revealed in the 6th season episode Orgalorg to be an ancient cosmic entity called Orgalorg, the Breaker of Worlds, who once attempted to absorb the power of a catalyst comet and was defeated by the four-faced deity Grob Gob Glob Grod, sent by Abraham Lincoln in his role as King of Mars. Orgalorg fell to Earth, and the planet's gravity compressed the entity down into a small, harmless penguin form, after which Orgalorg forgot everything, wandered for centuries, and eventually fell in with the Ice King's flock, without either of them knowing what the other one was. The show resolves the bulk of this mystery directly and explicitly, which is rare for it, but it leaves one small, deliberate gap open at the edge of the reveal a gap that fans have noticed and that the episode itself seems to invite you to notice. The show raises, without confirming, the possibility that Orgalorg's compressed penguin form wasn't purely an accident of physics, that something in the being itself might have wanted rest, might have been, in some sense, the show never quite states outright, tired of being the breaker of worlds. That's speculation. The show plants the seed of the idea through tone and through the eventual resolution of Gunter's arc, but it never says it as a flat fact. And it's worth being honest about that distinction, even while sitting with how moving the implication is. In the series finale, after Simon is freed from the crown, Gunter picks it up, and the crown grants Gunter's deepest desire, which turns out to be the wish to become like the one being who had been kind to him through all those forgotten centuries of wandering, the Ice King himself. Gunter becomes a cheerful, ridiculous ice wizard called the Ice Thing, marries Turtle Princess, and lives out something like contentment. An entity capable of breaking worlds wanted, in the end, only to be loved the way it once felt loved by accident, and the universe, through the strange machinery of a cursed crown, said yes to that wish. That's not speculation. That's the show's stated ending for the character, and it remains one of the gentlest pieces of writing the series ever produced. The crown itself carries one of the deepest and most quietly devastating mysteries in the entire show, because the show eventually explained where it came from, and the explanation makes everything retroactively sadder rather than simpler. The episode Evergreen, set during the Cretaceous period among dinosaurs, reveals that the crown was built by an ancient ice elemental named Urgence Evergreen, who was trying to find a way to stop an approaching green catalyst comet, the same comet associated with the Lich, the same comet that would eventually cause the extinction of the dinosaurs regardless. Evergreen built the crown intending to wear it himself and wish the comet away, but before he could, his young assistant, a small dinosaur he affectionately called Gunter, put the crown on first, out of nothing more complicated than the desire to be as capable and admired as his guardian. The crown granted that wish in the only way wish-granting magic in this show ever works, literally and imperfectly, transforming Gunter into something like Evergreen rather than into Evergreen himself, a distorted echo shaped by desire running through an artifact without the precision of intent. Evergreen died. The comet was never stopped. The crown was left behind, eventually found millions of years later by an antiquarian named Simon Petrikov, who had no idea what he was buying from a dock worker in Scandinavia. And the crown did to Simon exactly what it had done to the dinosaur, not because Simon was uniquely susceptible to it, but because the crown is, in some sense, the show never fully unpacks in mechanical terms, still running the very first wish it was ever asked to grant. Every wearer since has been folded into the same transformation, an ice wizard, immortal, slowly losing the specific shape of who they used to be. This raises a genuine open question. The show never directly answers. Is the crown sentient, in any meaningful sense, capable of choosing its wearers or steering events toward itself? Or is it simply a mechanism running an ancient, blind, unchangeable program with no awareness of what it's doing or to whom? The show leans toward the second reading in most of its visual language, treating the crown as inert object rather than active will, but it never rules out the first reading entirely, and there are moments, particularly in how reliably the crown finds its way to people whose deepest desires happen to align with becoming something like Evergreen, that leave room for genuine ambiguity. That ambiguity is, I'd argue, intentional. The show is more interested in what the crown's effects mean for the people it touches than in settling the metaphysics of whether the artifact itself has anything like intention. Simon Petrikov's full story is, by now, one of the more thoroughly documented arcs in the show, but there remain specific edges of it that were never fully resolved, and it's worth being precise about which parts are confirmed fact and which parts are reasonable inference, filling in gaps the show left open. We know, as stated fact within the show, that Simon was an antiquarian, a specialist in ancient artifacts, engaged to a woman named Betty, and that he purchased the crown from a dock worker in northern Scandinavia without understanding its history or its danger. We know he put it on, that the exact circumstances of that first moment vary slightly depending on which account within the show's own internal continuity you're weighing, with some tellings suggesting it was spontaneous curiosity, and others suggesting he put it on specifically to make Betty laugh. We know he began recording video diaries on tape as the crown's influence accelerated, documenting his own dissolution with the discipline of a man who had spent his career documenting other things and who, even as he lost himself, kept some scholars' instinct for record-keeping intact. We know, because the show eventually confirmed it through the visual evidence of the Farm World timeline and through Prismo's explanation of how wishes ripple through alternate realities, that in a parallel version of events, where Simon used the crown to physically stop the mushroom bomb, he died beneath it, and the unworn, purposeless crown that resulted unleashed an ice age across the planet that was, by every measure the show offers, considerably worse than what actually happened in the primary timeline. This means Simon's survival, his transformation into the Ice King, his 1,000 years of diminished personhood, was, by the show's own grim arithmetic, the better outcome among the available alternatives. That's a genuinely strange thing for a piece of children's entertainment to assert as settled fact, and it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. What remains less settled, what the show gestures toward without fully closing, is the precise nature of what happened to Betty in the years between her departure after Simon's first blackout and her reappearance many centuries later in the show's present timeline. The episode Betty shows her arriving through some combination of time, magic, and sheer determination, having apparently lived through the intervening centuries by some means the show never fully explains, acquiring magical knowledge across that span in order to attempt Simon's rescue. How she survived that long, what she did during all those centuries, whether she aged at a normal human rate or was preserved by some magical means the show never names, is left almost entirely blank. We get the destination of her journey and almost nothing of the road that got her there. Her ultimate fate, sacrificing her own identity by merging with the chaos entity Golb in order to save Simon and the world simultaneously, transforming into a being called Golbetti, is one of the show's most fully resolved emotional arcs, even while the mechanical specifics of how she traveled through time to begin with remain genuinely unexplained. The show, characteristically, prioritized the emotional truth of her sacrifice over the narrative plumbing required to get her there, and most viewers, watching it land, don't seem to mind the gap nearly as much as they might in a show more committed to explaining its own machinery. Marceline's mother is one of the cleanest examples in the entire series of a mystery the show simply never addressed, not partially, not through implication, not at all. We know, as confirmed fact, that Marceline is half demon through her father Hunson Abadir, ruler of the Nightosphere, and half human through her mother, whose existence is referenced but who is never named, never shown in any flashback, never given so much as a single line of dialogue or a description beyond the bare fact of having existed and having been human. We don't know if she survived the Mushroom War or died in it. We don't know if she and Hudson were ever in any meaningful relationship beyond the biological fact of Marceline's conception, or whether their connection was something closer to circumstance in a collapsing world. We don't know what she looked like, what she believed, what she wanted, or what happened to her in the chaos that followed the bombs. This is not a mystery the show teases with clues scattered through the background of episodes the way it does with the Mushroom Wars timeline. It's a mystery the show simply never engaged with at all. An entire person's worth of absence sitting at the root of one of the show's most beloved characters, never filled in across 10 seasons and multiple spin-offs. Fan speculation has filled the silence in countless ways over the years. Theories about her being a refugee, theories tying her into other unexplained human survivors, glimpsed briefly in background shots, but none of it carries any weight of confirmation from the show itself, and it's worth naming that distinction clearly. This is pure, unfilled absence, the rarest kind of mystery the show has, because most of its mysteries come with at least a few scattered clues. This one comes with none. Let's talk about Susan Strong, because her arc is one of the show's longest-running mysteries, and one of the most carefully, patiently resolved, stretched out across nearly the entire run of the series, before finally landing somewhere concrete. When she first appears in the second season episode that bears her name, she's presented as a curious, somewhat fearful figure leading an underground tribe called the Humans, wearing a fish-shaped helmet that conceals most of her face, struggling with English, exhibiting strength and behavior that leaves open the tantalizing possibility that she might be another human like Finn, possibly even in the wilder edges of fan speculation that circulated for years, his mother. We eventually learn that her birth name is Kara, that she carried the designation Seeker XJ77 from an earlier role she served before losing that identity, and that she is, in fact, a cybernetically enhanced human, not a separate mutant species. The show teases this question of her humanity for years in small, deliberate beats. In the third season episode Botopia, she lets Finn reach beneath her hat to feel whether she has the gill structures of her tribe or the smooth skin of an unaltered human, and the show withholds the answer from the audience entirely, letting Finn's private knowledge of the truth sit unspoken between the two of them while we're left to wonder. It isn't until much later, in episodes like Dark Purple, and especially in the pre-boot and reboot pair, that the show reveals she carries a cybernetic implant installed by a figure named Dr. Gross that can be remotely activated to override her will and steer her toward objectives she has no memory of choosing. The full picture only comes into focus during the Islands miniseries, which aired as part of the 7th season, when we learn she originated from Founders Island, a hidden community of surviving humans who had organized themselves around extreme caution and isolation in the aftermath of the war, and that she had served there as a seeker, a kind of enforcer tasked with preventing other islanders from leaving the protected settlement. The Islands episode Hide and Seek works almost as a single concentrated dose of exposition, laying out the policies and underlying fear that shaped Founders Island's entire approach to survival, and revealing how much freedom its inhabitants actually had to sacrifice in exchange for safety. What remains genuinely unexplained, even after all of this resolution, is the specific mechanism by which Susan lost her memory and ended up among the humans in the first place, disconnected entirely from her former life as Kara. The show gives us a brief, almost subliminal glimpse during her time in the cockpit of a recon ship in the early episodes of Islands, a flash of imagery suggesting her as a child on Founders Island, and a suggestion, never confirmed outright, that some kind of guardian system or security mechanism may have struck her down before her memory loss. But the actual sequence of events connecting her departure from the island to her new life leading an underground tribe is never walked through directly. It's a mystery the show built almost an entire decade of patient material around, resolving the largest question, what is she, definitively, while leaving the smaller, mechanical question of how she got from one life to the other, permanently in shadow. The ancient psychic tandem war elephant is a smaller mystery, but a genuinely strange one, and it's worth pausing on because of how casually the show handles a creature this powerful and this ancient. He is referred to consistently as the ancient psychic tandem war elephant, with the definite article suggesting he may be the only one of his kind in existence, a two-headed psychic war machine summoned into being through a wish Finn made within a magical realm called the Labyrinth. When he resurfaces years later in the episode Something Big, he's recognized by an elemental antagonist named Darren, who calls him Eli, a nickname that implies the two of them share some history, predating the events of the show entirely. That history is never explained. We get the nickname, we get the unmistakable familiarity in how Darren addresses him, and we get nothing else. Where did a being like this come from before Finn's wish summoned him? Was he dormant somewhere, waiting? The same way the Lich spent a season hiding inside an ordinary garden snail? Did he have an entire history of warfare alongside Darren in some earlier age of Ooze mythology that the show simply never bothered to dramatize? The episode doesn't say. After the battle, Finn frees the elephant from the obligation of following orders, which sends the creature into something close to an existential crisis, wandering the land, trying to determine what it means to exist without a master to command it. The episode plays this almost as comedy, an action sequence collapsing into a surprisingly sincere meditation on purpose and freedom, and critics, at the time, praised how convincingly the show managed to make a war elephant's personal crisis feel like a genuine argument for existentialism rather than a throwaway joke. It's one of the show's purest examples of a mystery that exists purely for tone and texture, never meant to be solved, only meant to deepen the sense that Ooh has a past stretching back further than any single character, even one as ancient as Marceline, can fully account for. The Door Lord is one of the show's strangest unresolved threads, mostly because of how confidently the episode introducing him treats his species as an established, recurring feature of Oo's ecosystem, and then never brings them back. The Door Lord first appears in the episode What Was Missing, where he steals small, deeply sentimental objects from Finn, Jake, Princess Bubblegum, Marceline, and BMO, apparently with the underlying intention of teaching the group that friendship matters more than any possession, accomplished by forcing them to cooperate in order to get their things back. Princess Bubblegum reveals that she once attempted to imprison members of this species, but that containment proved impossible because Door Lords possess the inherent ability to open portal-like doors to anywhere, meaning no cell the Candy Kingdom could build was ever capable of holding one. The species is established within this single episode as plural, a recognized kind of being with its own name, its own established behavior pattern, and apparently enough cultural footprint within Ooh that Bubblegum has dealt with the problem of containing them before. And then, having built all of that texture into a single half-hour episode, the show simply never returns to it. No other Door Lord appears across the remaining 7 seasons. Bubblegum's earlier history with the species, whatever incidents led her to attempt locking them up in the first place, is never elaborated on. It's a piece of world building introduced with total confidence and then abandoned entirely, and it stands as one of the clearest examples in the whole series of a mystery. The show created by accident, simply by building a rich enough world that even its smaller details implied histories the writers never had the runway to actually explore. That same episode carries a second mystery worth sitting with, one that resolved itself not through anything stated directly in the original episode, but through years of slow confirmation that arrived gradually across the rest of the show's run. What Was Missing became controversial at the time of its original airing because of a strongly implied past romantic relationship between Marceline and Princess Bubblegum, suggested through a song Marceline sings about feeling personally betrayed by Bubblegum, and through the detail of Bubblegum secretly wearing, as private sleepwear, a rock t-shirt Marceline had given her years earlier. Marceline's voice actress Olivia Olson confirmed years later at a public book signing that according to creator Pendleton Ward, the two characters had indeed dated in the past, but that broadcast standards in regions where the show aired discouraged explicit depictions of same-sex relationships, which kept the show from confirming the relationship outright within the text itself for years. It wasn't until the series finale, Come Along With Me, that the show was finally able to say plainly what it had been implying since that earlier episode, when Marceline and Bubblegum share an unambiguous kiss. This is a case where the mystery wasn't really a narrative gap at all, but a restriction imposed from outside the writer's room, a story the creative team clearly wanted to tell from very early on, but had to tell sideways, in subtext and implication, for years before circumstances allowed them to say it directly. It's worth knowing that distinction, because it changes how you read every quiet, loaded glance between the two characters across the seasons that came before the finale. The mystery wasn't whether the writers knew. The mystery, for years, was only when the audience would be allowed to know it too. Jake's origin is a mystery with a genuinely unusual shape because the show appears to have offered two competing explanations across its run and never fully clarified which one was meant to be taken as the literal truth within its own continuity. According to the series, in the episode generally referred to by fans as the Joshua and Margaret episode, Jake was conceived after his father Joshua was bitten by a shape-shifting, extra-dimensional creature during a detective investigation conducted alongside his pregnant wife, and Jake was later born from a pustule that formed on his father's head as a direct result of that creature's bite. It's strongly implied within the show that Jake's stretching powers are connected biologically to this creature, even though Jake himself appears to remain entirely unaware of the true circumstances of his own birth, instead, believing throughout the series that his powers came from rolling around in a magical mud puddle as a puppy, an explanation introduced in an earlier season that the later episode seems to directly contradict. The show never reconciles these two accounts. It never has Jake learn the truth about his actual origin, never shows him discovering the mud puddle story was something less than literal fact, and never directly confirms, through any narration outside the events of that single episode, that the pustule birth account is meant to be taken as objectively true rather than as one possible explanation among several offered within the show's own loosely structured mythology. Fans have spent years debating which version is canon, and the honest answer, based on what the show has actually put on screen, is that both versions exist simultaneously within the text, contradicting each other, and the show never resolved the contradiction. It's worth labeling this clearly as an open mystery rather than a settled fact, because plenty of recap material online states the pustule birth version as though it were uncontested canon, when in fact it sits alongside an earlier, equally unconfirmed explanation, with no episode ever directly adjudicating between the two. Jake's parents carry their own separate, smaller, sadder mystery, one the show never tried particularly hard to resolve. Joshua, Jake's father, passed away at some point before the events of the series began, and his cause of death has never been explained on screen. An episode called Dad's Dungeon shows a hologram of Joshua being attacked by a creature referred to as the evil monster, an attack that seems to have occurred when Jake was still a baby, though Joshua evidently survived that particular encounter, since later dialogue confirms Finn helped Jake bury his father long after, in the episode Billy's Bucket List. Margaret's death is treated with even less specificity, referenced only obliquely in passing dialogue across various episodes, with the show never devoting so much as a single flashback to the actual circumstances of how either parent died. It's a strange absence to sit with, given how much screen time the show devoted to Finn's parents, to Marceline's father, to Simon's transformation. Joshua and Margaret, despite shaping both Finn and Jake's entire childhoods, and despite appearing warmly and vividly in numerous flashback sequences while they were alive, simply exit the story off-screen, their endings left as a fact stated, rather than a scene shown. Whether that absence was a deliberate choice meant to mirror how grief in real life often arrives without a witnessed final scene, or simply a thread the writers never got around to picking up before the show ended, is something the show itself never tells us, and probably never will. Finn's father Martin carries a mystery of his own, one that resolves partially and then deliberately leaves a door open rather than closing it. Martin is established as a con artist who fled the protected human settlement on Hub Island with an infant Finn after being discovered by people from his own troubled past, eventually separating from his son when the baby was set adrift on a raft heading toward the mainland. Years later, in Escape from the Citadel, Finn discovers his father imprisoned within the Citadel, a multiversal prison reserved specifically for beings who have committed what the show terms a cosmic crime, a phrase that implies an entire category of wrongdoing. The show never bothers to define in any concrete, legal, or moral sense what exactly Martin did to earn imprisonment in a facility reserved for cosmic-level offenses is never specified. We're given his general character, his selfishness, his charm, his unwillingness to be the father Finn needed, but the specific crime that landed him in a prison built to contain beings dangerous on a cosmic scale is left entirely unstated. It's possible the show intended this vagueness deliberately, framing Martin's eventual fate, accepting an offer from a purple catalyst comet and transcending to some higher, unreachable plane of existence as a kind of cosmic escape hatch the universe granted him specifically because his actual offense mattered less to the story than the emotional fact of his absence. But the gap remains, and it's one of the cleaner examples in the show of a mystery introduced through a single loaded phrase, cosmic crime, that the writers apparently never intended to spend an entire episode unpacking. There's a mystery buried in the recurring image of the cosmic owl that's worth pulling apart carefully, because the show treats this figure with such consistent visual weight across multiple seasons that it clearly matters to the underlying cosmology. Even though it's never given a full direct explanation, the cosmic owl appears across several episodes inhabiting people's dreams, generally in moments tied to significant emotional turning points, often connected to themes of choice, fate, and the difficulty of letting go of one possible future in order to step into another. Characters who encounter him in dreams tend to wake, having gained some piece of insight they didn't have before, insight that nudges the plot in a specific direction. The show never states outright what the cosmic owl actually is within its cosmology, whether he's a discrete entity with his own agenda, a personification of fate itself, or simply a recurring visual motif the writers found useful without ever intending him to carry literal metaphysical weight. This is a case worth being honest about. Most of what circulates online, treating the cosmic owl as a confirmed cosmic entity on the same tier as Prismo or Golb, is interpretation rather than confirmed fact. The show gives him presence and pattern, but never gives him an origin story, a stated nature, or a place in any of the show's more explicit cosmological hierarchies the way it eventually did for the Lich, for Orgolorg, and for Golb. He remains, by design or by accident, one of the purest pieces of unexplained dream logic the show ever committed to its own canon. I want to return to something we touched on near the beginning, because it deserves a slower look. The show's handling of magic's return to the world after the Mushroom War carries an interesting, half-explained logic worth sitting with. The mutagenic mushroom bomb, beyond mutating much of Earth's existing life, brought about a resurgence of magic that had been in decline for most of human history, a detail the show treats as settled background fact, woven directly into its account of what the bomb actually did to the world. What's left genuinely open is the mechanism behind that resurgence, the actual causal chain connecting a nuclear-adjacent detonation to a worldwide return of magical forces that had apparently been receding for centuries before the war. Was the bomb itself partly magical in composition, perhaps influenced by the Lich's dormant presence already lurking somewhere in the world before his physical emergence, as some long-running fan theories have proposed? Or was the resurgence simply a side effect of catastrophic environmental and biological upheaval on a scale large enough to shake something loose in the underlying structure of reality itself? The show never picks between these explanations. It states the effect with total confidence and leaves the cause sitting in shadow, which is, by this point in our exploration tonight, something close to a structural habit for this particular piece of storytelling. Adventure Time consistently prefers to hand you the consequence and let you sit with the unanswered question of the cause, trusting that the feeling of the unresolved question is often more valuable to the story than any explanation could be. Let's talk, for a while, about Princess Bubblegum, because there's a category of mystery surrounding her that the show treated with more deliberate restraint than almost anything else in its run. Restraint that feels less like an oversight and more like a genuine ethical choice the writers made about what kind of darkness they were willing to fully illuminate. There's a room somewhere beneath the Candy Kingdom that the show has referenced obliquely across multiple episodes, but never shown in full, a space associated with the darker, more violent measures Bubblegum has historically used to handle threats against her people, and Peppermint Butler's connections to whatever happens in that space are part of what makes his role within the kingdom's actual infrastructure considerably more complicated than his cheerful, harmless public persona. As a polite candy butler would suggest, we know he practices genuine dark magic. We know he has connections to death itself, to the underworld, to forces well beyond what any ordinary royal attendant should reasonably have access to. We know he's summoned portals to the underworld on Bubblegum's behalf, and that the show treats these moments with a tone that signals real weight, even while wrapping them in enough comedy that a younger viewer might miss the implications entirely. What we don't get, ever, across the entire run of the show is a full accounting of exactly what's kept in that room, exactly what Peppermint Butler has done in service of the kingdom's security, or exactly how far Bubblegum's willingness to use dark, hidden methods of control actually extends. The show lets the shadow exist as shadow. It gives you the outline, the implication, the unmistakable sense that something serious is being concealed, and then it simply declines to switch the lights on. That restraint feels less like the writers running out of time and more like a considered decision about which of the show's darknesses deserved full illumination and which deserved to remain permanently, just barely visible at the edge of the frame. There's a related, smaller mystery tucked inside Bubblegum's history that the show handles with similar restraint, the question of exactly what happened between her and Marceline to create the long, cool distance that defines so much of their relationship across the early and middle seasons. The show never spells this out the way it eventually spelled out Simon's origin or the precise circumstances of Marceline's childhood in the ruins. What we get instead is texture, behavior, the specific way Marceline says Bubblegum's first name, and the specific way Bubblegum's expression changes when she hears it, evidence accumulated through years of small, careful character work rather than through any single explanatory scene. It wasn't until the Distant Lands special Obsidian, which aired well after the original series finale, that the show finally filled in the specific cause of their falling out directly, revealing that both of them had been right about something and wrong about something else, and that the years of distance between them had, in retrospect, been something close to a waste of time that both characters had quietly regretted the entire time. That special is widely regarded among critics and longtime viewers as giving the earlier episodes a much deeper retroactive meaning, particularly what was missing. Once you understand the actual history underneath everything the two characters were avoiding saying to each other. This is worth naming as one of the show's clearest examples of a mystery resolved not within the original text, but years later, through a deliberately separate piece of expanded material, a pattern. The franchise repeated more than once as it continued telling stories about Ooh, well past its official conclusion. The question of what, precisely, BMO is remains one of the show's most openly unresolved mysteries, and unlike most of the others we've walked through tonight, this one feels unresolved by design rather than by accident or lack of time. BMO was built as a video game console, a fact the show states plainly and never contradicts, and yet across the show's run, BMO develops something the show consistently treats as a genuine interior life, complete with private games, imagined conversations with inanimate objects, a Season 5 solo episode called Noir, structured as an entire detective mystery told from BMO's own perspective, complete with BMO talking to themselves and to insects and inhabiting elaborate imagined scenarios with what the episode frames as complete sincerity rather than malfunction. The show never settles the question of where, exactly, BMO falls within its own cosmological hierarchy of beings. BMO isn't treated as a cosmic entity on the scale of the Lich or Orgalorg. BMO isn't ancient in the way Marceline or Simon are ancient. BMO occupies a category the show never names. A small robot who appears to have simply decided, at some point, to become a person, and who was allowed to become one entirely because the people around BMO chose to love and treat BMO as one. Even BMO's gender remains deliberately unresolved within the show's own text. Different characters use different pronouns across different episodes, and the show's own dialogue never settles on one consistently, a choice that voice actor Nikki Yang has discussed in interviews as intentional rather than incidental. This is one of the rare mysteries in the show's run that feels less like an open question waiting for a future answer and more like a permanent, deliberate refusal to answer, a structural decision about what kind of character BMO was always meant to be, comfortable existing without ever being fully categorized. Let's go back to Finn for a moment, because there's a specific cosmic mystery surrounding him that the show plants carefully across its later seasons without ever fully spelling out the mechanics. The Catalyst Comet mythology establishes, through accumulated implication rather than any single direct statement, that certain comets carry with them a soul, a force, or an essence that incarnates into the physical world, choosing. In some sense, the show never mechanically explains to be born. The Lich represents one such essence, tied to a green comet associated with inevitable death and entropy. Finn, the show implies through the visual language surrounding these comets, is connected to a blue comet representing something closer to heroism, to the active choice to do good rather than simply exist passively in the world. The show never states directly that Finn has lived before in some literal sense of reincarnation, the way it states more concretely that the Lich's essence predates the universe. It plants the idea, lets the parallel sit visually next to the Lich's own origin story, and trusts the audience to feel the implied weight of it, without ever drawing a Wanjan explicit family tree connecting Finn to any specific past incarnation. This is speculation built on the show's own visual patterning rather than a confirmed plot point, and it's worth treating it that way. Even while acknowledging how deliberately the show seems to want you to draw the connection yourself. There's one more mystery worth walking through carefully before we start moving toward the bottom of tonight's descent, and it concerns the actual fate of certain side characters the show simply stopped checking in on. Frida, the friend Susan Strong reconnects with during the Islands miniseries, is given a clear, hopeful conclusion within those episodes, choosing to leave the protected island life behind in search of her own future. But many of the smaller human characters, glimpsed briefly during Islands, residents of Founders Island whose faces appear for a single scene and never again, are simply never followed up on after the miniseries concludes. We don't know what became of most of that community once the Guardian system protecting their isolation was finally shut down, whether they integrated into the wider world of Ooh, whether some chose to remain isolated regardless, or whether the show simply considered their individual fates beside the point of the larger story it was telling about Finn's relationship to his own origins. This is a smaller, gentler kind of mystery than the cosmic ones we've spent most of tonight inside, but it's worth naming because it's representative of something true about how this show worked at its best. It built worlds full of named, specific, briefly glimpsed people, gave you just enough of each one to feel their reality, and then, more often than not, let most of them simply continue existing somewhere off screen, living lives the camera never had time to follow, the way real people do in a world too large for any single story to fully contain. There's a fragment of mystery sitting inside the character of Flame Princess that's smaller than the ones we've spent the most time on tonight, but worth pulling out and holding up to the light anyway, because it touches on something the show was generally careful about and occasionally wasn't. Flame Princess was created by the Flame King and kept imprisoned inside a lantern for most of her early life, specifically because her father feared the scale of destructive power she might be capable of if allowed to mature freely, a containment built on a kind of preemptive distrust that the show frames, eventually, as its own form of abuse rather than reasonable caution. What the show never fully accounts for is the actual chain of events inside the Fire Kingdom that led to that decision being made in the first place. What, specifically, the Flame King observed or feared about his daughter's nature that convinced him imprisonment was the only safe option, and what happened to the kingdom's internal politics in the years she spent locked away that allowed that decision to go unchallenged by anyone else in a position of power. We get the result. A princess raised in isolation, taught to distrust her own feelings, because her own feelings were treated, almost literally, as a weapons system to be managed. We don't get the committee meeting, so to speak, the actual deliberation inside Fire Kingdom leadership that arrived at containment as a reasonable strategy. It's a mystery that matters less for its plot mechanics and more for what it implies about how casually entire kingdoms in seem willing to make irreversible decisions about a person's freedom long before that person is old enough to have any say in the matter. A pattern that, once you notice it in Flame Princess's story, you start noticing quietly repeated elsewhere across the show, in Lemongrab's confinement to his own earldom, in the way Founders Island restricted an entire population's movement for generations in the name of safety. The show doesn't resolve any of this into a single clean moral statement. It just keeps returning to the same shape of harm, kingdoms protecting themselves by constraining the people inside them, without ever fully interrogating where that impulse comes from, or what, if anything, could break the pattern permanently across all of Oo's many separate governments. Lemongrab himself carries a mystery worth sitting with a little longer than we did earlier, because the show is explicit that Princess Bubblegum considers him her first attempt to create an entirely new form of life, a fact stated plainly rather than left to inference, and explicit that the attempt failed in the specific sense that Lemongrab is constitutionally incapable of functioning within ordinary social structures, prone to shrieking, paranoid, frequently cruel in ways that read as genuinely tragic rather than simply comic, once you understand how directly his nature traces back to errors in his own creation. What the show never explains in any technical sense is what, specifically, went wrong in the process of his making. Bubblegum is a scientist who succeeded, by every visible measure, in creating an entire functioning, generally stable society of candy people who feel, by the show's own depiction, recognizably alive and recognizably happy much of the time. Lemongrab represents a clear deviation from that success, and the show never walks us through the actual biological or alchemical reasoning behind why this particular creation came out so different from everything else she made. Was it an early experiment, conducted before she'd refined whatever process eventually produced the rest of the Candy Kingdom's population? A first draft she never had the heart or the practical ability to simply undo. Was there something specific about the lemon-based composition she used for him that interacted badly with whatever animating principle she relies on? The show leaves this entirely in the realm of implication, content to let lemongrab exist as evidence of failure without ever fully diagramming the failure itself, and Bubblegum's quiet, persistent sense of obligation toward him across the seasons that follow reads less like guilt over a specific, identifiable mistake, and more like the general, diffuse responsibility anyone carries towards something they made and cannot unmake, regardless of whether they ever fully understand what went wrong in the making. Finn's relationship with his own lost right arm opens onto one of the stranger, more layered mysteries in the back half of the show's run, because the loss itself eventually folds into questions about identity and duplication that the show only partially resolves. Finn loses the arm during a sequence of events in the 5th season tied to the Lich, the Time Wish, and a grass sword that had, unbeknownst to him, been quietly growing around his arm across several earlier episodes, embedding itself into his body in ways the show plants well before the actual loss occurs. A slow, patient piece of foreshadowing that rewards close attention on rewatch. What happens after the loss is where the mystery deepens. Finn eventually regrows the arm through a sequence involving a dimension called the Grasslands and the emergence of a being called Fern, a grass creature shaped in Finn's exact image, who comes into existence through the merger of the original grass sword and an artifact called the Finn Sword, itself a remnant from a collapsed alternate timeline. Fern is, by every reasonable reading the show supports, a genuine duplicate of Finn, sharing memories, mannerisms, even something close to Finn's personality, and the show spends real narrative weight exploring what it means for two beings this similar to exist simultaneously, treating Fern not as a simple plot device, but as a character with his own arc, his own grief, his own eventual, hard-won claim to an identity distinct from the original he was copied from. What the show never fully settles is the deeper metaphysical question sitting underneath all of this. Is Fern, in any meaningful sense, the same person as Finn, sharing some continuous thread of identity through the shared sword and shared memory, or is he something genuinely new, a separate consciousness that simply happens to have started from the same template? The show seems to lean, by the end of Fern's arc, toward treating him as his own distinct person deserving his own distinct fate, but it never delivers a single decisive line of dialogue settling the question philosophically, leaving it instead as one of the more quietly profound, open questions the show ever raised about what actually constitutes a continuous self. The Citadel, the multiversal prison holding Finn's father Martin, deserves a slightly longer look than we gave it earlier, because the show treats the concept of a cosmic crime as though it were an established legal category with real weight and real enforcement mechanisms, while never showing us a single other inmate's specific offense in comparable detail, and never showing us who, exactly, built or governs the facility. We see other prisoners glimpsed briefly during Finn's time there, strange beings clearly meant to suggest a wider universe of crime and consequence beyond anything Ooze surface-level kingdoms ever deal with directly, but their individual stories remain entirely unexplored. The Citadel functions almost like a held breath in the show's mythology, a glimpse of an entire justice system operating on a scale the rest of the series never otherwise acknowledges, introduced specifically to house one personal, intimate story about a disappointing father, and then quietly closed back up once that story concludes. Whoever or whatever decided Martin's behavior constituted a cosmic crime worthy of multiversal imprisonment, and whatever process exists for someone to be released, tried, or judged within that system remains permanently outside the show's interest. It exists exactly long enough to serve the emotional beat it was built for, and then the door swings shut on it for good. Prismo's death and eventual return is worth revisiting with a bit more care because the mechanics of how a being who exists entirely outside of normal time can die and then come back are handled by the show with a specific kind of narrative shorthand that, examined closely, doesn't fully add up into anything mechanically coherent and probably isn't meant to. The Lich enters the time room specifically to kill Prismo and seize control of his wish-granting power, succeeding, at least temporarily, in an act of violence the show treats with real weight. Despite Prismo's generally cheerful, low-stakes presentation in every other episode he appears in, Prismo's return, when it eventually happens, is explained through vague reference to the particular way the time room interacts with time itself, a phrase that gestures at an explanation without actually constituting one. The show seems to be relying here on an underlying logic it's already established elsewhere, that beings tied closely enough to the structure of time and cosmic law in this universe don't experience death the same way more grounded characters do. The same underlying logic that presumably explains how the Lich himself keeps returning across multiple defeats throughout the series. But the show never states this logic outright as a unifying rule. It simply applies the same general pattern repeatedly. Cosmic beings die, cosmic beings come back, without ever pausing to articulate why that pattern holds, or what specific conditions would be required to make a death of this kind permanent. It's one of the clearer examples in the show's mythology of an internal rule the writers clearly understood intuitively, well enough to use consistently, without ever feeling obligated to write the rule down anywhere the audience could actually read it. Golb himself, the entity sitting above even the Lich in the show's cosmic hierarchy, the embodiment of chaos that the Lich serves as a kind of devoted scholar, remains one of the most genuinely underexplained figures the show ever introduced, made stranger by how late in the show's run he actually appears as a fully realized threat. We're given, through the episode Casper and Nova, the framing of the Lich's entire campaign of destruction as devotion rather than personal hatred, an offering made in service of honoring Golb's chaotic nature, but we're never given any account of what, specifically, Golb is in any originating sense, where Golb came from, whether Golb has any consciousness comparable to a personality the way the Lich clearly does, or whether Golb represents something closer to a pure cosmic force without anything resembling intention at all. When Golb finally arrives in Oo during the series finale, summoned through Betty's ritual gone partially wrong, the show depicts the entity's presence almost entirely through consequence rather than character. Things that enter Golb's body get unmade and reassembled into simplified versions of themselves, a visual representation of chaos consuming complexity rather than any scene of Golb speaking, reasoning, or revealing motive in any way comparable to how thoroughly the show let us into the Lich's own perspective across multiple earlier episodes. Betty's eventual transformation of the entity into a gentler form called Golbetty resolves the immediate crisis of the finale, but it resolves nothing about what Golb fundamentally is, leaving the show's own cosmic ceiling, the entity above even its most ancient and dangerous villain, as the single least explained piece of its entire mythology. That may be intentional. There's a long tradition across mythology generally of leaving whatever sits at the absolute top of a cosmology the least defined, the most resistant to clean description, and Adventure Time's treatment of Golb fits comfortably inside that tradition, whether the writers were consciously drawing on it or simply arrived at the same instinct independently. There's a particular detail glimpsed in the anthology episode 1000 plus Graybles that's worth returning to with more care than we gave it earlier, because of how directly it complicates the finale's eventual, apparently tidy resolution of the Ice King's fate. In that earlier episode, set in a far future version of Ooh, viewers catch sight of a strange, bat-like creature bearing an unmistakable resemblance to the Ice King flying through a landscape considerably more decayed and desperate than the Ooh audiences had grown familiar with by that point in the series. The implication, never stated outright, but strongly suggested by the visual design and the episode's general tone of advanced future decay, is that the crown's power might eventually pass to a different wearer somewhere far down the show's own future timeline, continuing the same cycle of transformation that has already claimed at least two confirmed wearers, the dinosaur Gunter and the human Simon. The series finale resolves Simon's relationship to the crown definitively within its own present-day timeline, freeing him and transferring the crown's power through Gunter, the penguin's wish, into the considerably gentler Ice Thing persona. But 1000 plus Graybles was never explicitly walked back or recontextualized by anything that came later, leaving its glimpse of some future bat creature wearer, sitting in the show's own established continuity, as a thread that points toward an entirely different possible future for the crown. One, the finale's tidy ending, doesn't actually rule out happening eventually, however many centuries down the line. Whether the show's writers genuinely intended this as a deliberate piece of long-game foreshadowing, or whether it's simply an anthology episode's standalone, speculative future that was never meant to bind the finale's eventual choices, is itself an open question the show has never directly addressed, leaving fans free to read the unresolved tension between the two episodes, however, feels most true to them. The mystery of exactly what the humans are, as a species distinct from ordinary humans, deserves a slightly closer look than we gave it during the section on Susan Strong, because the show's eventual clarification that Susan herself is fully human rather than a separate mutant species leaves an open question about the rest of her tribe that the show never circles back to resolve with the same level of care. If Susan is confirmed human, augmented by cybernetic enhancement rather than altered by any deeper biological mutation, what does that mean for the other members of the human tribe she leads, many of whom display physical characteristics, including the gill-like features referenced throughout her early appearances, that read as something considerably more altered than simple cybernetic enhancement could explain on its own? The show never gives a clean account of whether the broader Hyo-Man population represents a genuinely different evolutionary branch of post-war humanity, descended from survivors who adapted differently to the mutagenic fallout than the more isolated, protected population on Founders Island did, or whether the show simply never fully thought through the biological consistency of a tribe whose individual members can apparently range anywhere from fully human, like Susan, to visibly altered in ways the show's own dialogue and visual design strongly imply, but never directly explains. It's a gap that becomes more noticeable the more carefully you compare the show's eventual, fairly precise explanation of Susan's specific origin against the considerably vaguer account it offers for the population she spent years leading. Hudson Abadir's actual nature and the full scope of his authority within the Nightosphere is another area where the show offers confident texture without offering anything like a complete account. We know he rules the Nightosphere, that he can consume the souls or essences of others to restore his own strength, famously demonstrated when he devours a portion of Marceline's life force after she sacrifices it to revive him in an earlier season, and that his relationship with his daughter is loving in its own genuinely strange way, despite his frequent, sometimes catastrophic absences from her life across the centuries since the Mushroom War. What the show never clarifies is the actual scope of his rule, whether the Nightosphere operates under any rules or higher authority above his own, whether other entities of comparable power exist within whatever broader cosmic structure governs death, darkness, and corruption in this universe, or what specifically happened to him during the war and its immediate aftermath that left him separated from Marceline at exactly the moment she needed protection most. We're shown, briefly, a flashback in the episode Memory of a Memory, depicting Hudson and a young Marceline together in the ruins of a diner sometime after the war, evidence that he wasn't entirely absent from her early life, the way some accounts of their relationship suggest. But the show never reconciles this glimpse with the clear impression elsewhere that he was largely missing during her most vulnerable years, the years when Simon stepped in instead to feed her and shelter her, and eventually, heartbreakingly, leave her as well. The contradiction between these two accounts of his presence or absence during her childhood is never directly addressed by the show, leaving Hudson Abadir's exact role in his daughter's formative years sitting in a kind of permanent, unresolved overlap between two stories that don't quite line up. Magic Man is a figure the show spent years treating as comic relief, before eventually revealing a backstory grim enough to recontextualize every earlier appearance. And even after that revelation, a meaningful portion of his history remains genuinely unaccounted for. We eventually learn that Magic Man was once a normal wizard named Joshua Butter, and that his transformation into a chaotic, frequently cruel trickster figure resulted from a magical mishap, an accidental side effect of overreaching into power he didn't fully understand or control. The show treats this revelation with real weight once it arrives, recontextualizing years of earlier episodes in which Magic Man's behavior, often played for laughs, suddenly reads as the actions of someone trapped inside a transformation he never consented to and has no clear path back from. What remains unexplained is the specific nature of the magical work he was attempting when the accident occurred, what he was actually trying to accomplish, whether his original ambitions before the transformation were noble, reckless, or somewhere in between, and whether any meaningful path back to his original identity exists within the show's own established rules of magic. We're given the fact of his fall without being given the shape of what he was reaching for when he fell, which leaves Magic Man sitting in a strange narrative position, a character the show clearly wanted you to feel sympathy for once his history came to light, without ever fully equipping you with enough information to understand the specific choice or ambition that cost him everything in the first place. Tree Trunks carries a quieter mystery worth pausing on, mostly because of how casually the show reveals, across a handful of scattered episodes, that her life prior to becoming Finn and Jake's beloved elderly elephant neighbor included an entire previous marriage to a man named Wyatt, A relationship that ended for reasons the show only ever gestures toward rather than fully narrates, and a career history hinted at through occasional throwaway lines that imply she lived a considerably more complicated, more adventurous life before settling into the quiet domesticity most viewers came to associate with her character. The show treats her past with the same light touch it brings to most of its incidental world building, dropping in details like breadcrumbs without ever committing to a full flashback episode dedicated entirely to walking through her history the way it eventually did for figures like Simon or Princess Bubblegum. We know enough to understand that Tree Trunks contains more history than her gentle apple pie baking present suggests, and the show seems entirely content, leaving the rest of that history to the audience's imagination, trusting that the implication itself, an elderly woman with an unexpectedly full past hiding behind a quiet exterior, carries enough emotional truth on its own without requiring further explanation. The mechanics of the Catalyst Comet system as a whole deserve one more pass before we finish, because the show treats the comets as load-bearing pieces of its cosmology, responsible for the Lich's arrival, implicated in Finn's own cosmic significance, and directly responsible for Martin's eventual transcendence at the end of his arc, while never fully clarifying the rules governing how often these comets appear, what determines which essence is carried by which comet, or whether the comets operate according to any will or intention of their own, versus simply functioning as cosmic delivery mechanisms with no awareness of their own purpose. We know there's a green comet tied to entropy and inevitable death, a blue comet tied to heroism, and a purple comet, glimpsed at the end of Martin's story and again in the eventual fate of Sweet Pea, that seems tied to some kind of transcendence or transformation beyond either of the other two categories. 3 comets, 3 colors, 3 broad cosmic functions, a structure clean enough to feel intentional and mysterious enough that the show never bothers explaining who or what originally assigned these specific colors to these specific cosmic roles, or whether other colors and other functions exist somewhere further out in whatever larger structure governs this layer of the show's mythology. It's the kind of systemic mystery that rewards exactly the kind of patient, accumulating attention this show consistently asked of its most devoted viewers, a hint of a larger structure glimpsed only at its edges, never once fully mapped. There's a smaller, more intimate mystery worth returning to before we close, the question of how, precisely, Finn's biological mother, Minerva Campbell, came to upload her own consciousness into the network of robots she uses to care for the human population on the islands. The show confirms the fact of the upload plainly, treating her resulting ageless, distributed existence as settled canon rather than ambiguous implication, but it never walks through the actual process by which a human consciousness, in this particular fictional universe, becomes transferable into machine form. What technology or knowledge that process required, whether anyone else among the surviving human population on the islands has ever attempted or even considered something similar, or whether Minerva's choice to do this was driven specifically by the trauma of losing her infant son, by some broader desire to extend her caregiving capacity across an entire community indefinitely, or by some combination the show never fully separates into distinct motivations. We're given the result: a mother who is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere within her community, profoundly devoted, and yet diffused across a network in a way that makes anything like ordinary, maternal closeness with the one child she actually lost, almost structurally impossible to recover. The show lets that tension sit unresolved in their eventual reunion scenes. Finn meeting a mother who loves him completely, and who is also, by the nature of what she chose to become, never quite fully present in any single place, at any single moment. A contradiction the show treats with sensitivity rather than explanation, content to let you feel the strangeness of it without ever fully accounting for the science underneath it. There's one more thread worth pulling before we let the rest of tonight's silence settle in, and it concerns the Wizard City sequences glimpsed across both the main series and the Distant Lands special that eventually bears that name. Wizards in Oo appear to operate under their own semi-independent governing structure, complete with battles, licensing requirements, and an entire administrative culture that the show treats as self-evidently real without ever explaining who founded it, how long it's existed, or what its actual relationship is to the various kingdoms scattered across the rest of the continent. We see wizards stripped of their powers as a form of punishment, a process the show depicts with surprising specificity, given how little else about wizard governance it bothers explaining. We see a wizard battle held with enough ceremony and tradition behind it to suggest decades or centuries of established precedent, and yet the show never tells us who holds ultimate authority over that tradition, whether it predates the Mushroom War entirely, or whether it sprang up sometime during the 1,000 years of rebuilding that followed, woven together by survivors who happened to discover magical aptitude after the resurgence the bomb triggered. The Distant Lands special Wizard City finally gives us an extended look inside this world, following Peppermint Butler as he enrolls at a school for wizards. But even that expanded glimpse functions more as a comedic showcase of the culture's eccentricities than as any kind of foundational history. We come away from it with a much richer sense of texture, robes and rituals, and bureaucratic absurdity, and almost no closer to understanding the actual origin of wizard society as a distinct, parallel institution running alongside everything else Oo has built since the war. The precise nature of Peppermint Butler's dark magic deserves a return visit here too, separate from the earlier discussion of the hidden room beneath the Candy Kingdom, because his abilities raise a narrower, more specific question the show never quite resolves. He's shown summoning portals to the underworld with apparent ease, conversing casually with death as though the two have a long-standing working relationship, and demonstrating familiarity with rituals that suggest formal training somewhere outside the otherwise cheerful, communal culture of the Candy Kingdom he serves. Where did he learn any of this? Candy people in general are shown throughout the series as Bubblegum's own creations, born from her scientific processes rather than raised through any conventional childhood, which raises the obvious question of how one of her own creations came to possess knowledge of dark magic predating, by every reasonable inference, his own creation. Did Bubblegum somehow imbue this knowledge into him deliberately when she made him, perhaps anticipating a need for exactly the kind of protection his abilities provide? Did he acquire it independently sometime after his creation, studying under some unnamed mentor the show never introduces? The series gives us his loyalty, his competence, and the unmistakable shadow trailing behind his cheerful exterior, and declines, consistently, to give us the specific education that produced any of it. The full geography of Oo Beyond, the handful of kingdoms the show regularly visits, remains another open question worth naming clearly before we close. We know From glimpses offered throughout the island's miniseries and from the visible shape of the broken planet seen in certain wide establishing shots, that the landmass Finn and Jake adventure across represents only a portion of a much larger, fractured Earth, a world whose surface was visibly reshaped by the detonation that ended the old civilization. We know there are other landmasses out there, implied rather than shown, holding their own pieces of the post-war story, their own surviving populations, their own unexplored history. The show, characteristically, never sends Finn and Jake far enough to actually map any of it. We get the land of Ooh in loving, granular detail, the Ice Kingdom and the Candy Kingdom and Castle Lemongrab and the Fire Kingdom and Lumpy Space and the Cloud Kingdom and the City of Thieves and dozens of smaller, stranger locations glimpsed in single episodes and then left behind. We get almost nothing of whatever exists beyond that, beyond the brief detour to the human islands, and the show seems entirely comfortable leaving the rest of the planet as an acknowledged but permanently unexplored fact, present in the background of the mythology, the way the edge of any known map simply trails off into blank, unlabeled space. There's a small, specific detail tucked into the Ice King's general behavior across the early seasons that deserves one more look before we let this particular thread close, because it's one of those mysteries that hides in plain sight, repeated so often across so many episodes that it almost stops registering as strange. He calls every single penguin in his possession by the same name, Gunter, regardless of how many of them surround him at any given moment, and the show eventually confirms, through the Crown's actual origin story in Evergreen, that this naming habit isn't simply a quirk of his diminished memory. It's a direct echo of the Crown's very first wearer, the young dinosaur whose name the Crown has apparently been carrying forward, embedded somewhere in its magic ever since that very first transformation took place, millions of years before any human being existed to wonder about it. What the show never quite explains is the actual mechanism by which a name survives inside an object across that scale of time, whether the Crown is storing some kind of residual memory belonging to its very first wearer, the way a person might carry forward a habit from childhood without remembering exactly where it came from, or whether the name itself has taken on some kind of independent magical weight that simply attaches automatically to anything resembling the original dinosaur's companion species. It's a question that sits at the exact intersection of two larger, unresolved mysteries we've already spent considerable time on tonight. The question of whether the Crown possesses anything like its own intention, and the deeper question of how exactly magic in this particular universe actually stores and transmits information across time. The show gives you the haunting repetition of the name without ever quite explaining the physics underneath it, and once you notice that every single penguin the Ice King has ever owned carries the ghost of a dinosaur's affection for its own guardian, the joke stops being a joke entirely and becomes one of the quietly saddest recurring details in the entire series. The question of exactly how widespread human survival actually was in the immediate aftermath of the Mushroom War remains genuinely unsettled even after the show's eventual reveal of the Founders Island community, because the show never reconciles the apparent scale of that surviving population against the much smaller, much more scattered picture suggested by everything we learn about Finn's own early life. If an entire organized human settlement, complete with its own government, its own security apparatus, its own schools and social structures, survived intact enough to maintain that level of organization across 1,000 years, it raises the question of why Finn himself was found alone, abandoned, with no immediate caretaker or community nearby, suggesting either that his particular branch of the human family had become separated from any larger surviving group well before his birth, or that there were, at various points across that 1,000-year span, multiple distinct surviving human populations who lost contact with one another entirely, drifting apart across the long, dangerous, mutation-filled landscape that the post-war Earth had become. The show never directly states which of these is true. It gives us one community, intact and isolated, and one child, alone and unclaimed, and lets the considerable gap between those two pictures of post-war human survival sit there, mostly unaddressed, a detail easy to miss, unless you're specifically looking for the places where the show's larger world building doesn't quite line up cleanly with its more intimate, personal storylines. I think about that gap sometimes, the distance between the organized, careful caution of Founder's Island and the raw, unprotected vulnerability of an infant left alone in the woods, and I think it captures something true about how this show actually worked underneath all of its colorful surface business. It never pretended the post-apocalyptic world it built was uniform in its suffering or uniform in its survival. Some people made it through into safety, behind walls, behind careful rules, behind generations of inherited caution. Other people made it through into nothing at all, into raw exposure, into the kind of childhood Finn had, found by chance, raised by accident, loved fiercely by people who weren't biologically obligated to love him at all. Both of those outcomes existed simultaneously in the same broken world, and the show never tried to smooth that unevenness into anything tidier than what it actually was. That unevenness is, I'd argue, one more quiet version of the same lesson every other mystery tonight has been circling around without ever quite stating directly. The world Adventure Time built doesn't owe you a complete explanation for why some of its people ended up safe and some of its people ended up exposed. The same way, our own world has never owed anyone a complete explanation for the same uneven distribution of fortune and danger. The show simply shows you both outcomes, side by side, and lets you sit with the difference. We've gone a long way down tonight, further, probably, than most single conversations about this show ever bother going, through wars without causes and crowns without full intention, and parents nobody ever quite explained, an entire species who appeared once and never came back. There's more down here, almost certainly. There always is, in a world built with this much patience and this much restraint. Every time someone goes back through these episodes carefully enough, a new detail surfaces, a background prop nobody had noticed before, a line of dialogue that lands differently once you know what comes later, a connection between two seemingly unrelated episodes that only becomes visible once you've watched the whole series enough times to hold most of it in your head at once. That's the nature of a world built this way. It doesn't stop giving things up just because one long night of careful attention has reached its end. There will be more down here next time, waiting in exactly the same patient, unhurried way everything in Ooh seems to wait for whoever happens to come looking next. There's a mystery worth folding in here too, related to the same era of the show, concerning exactly how widely the resurgence of magic spread across the rest of the planet beyond the specific stretch of land the show actually depicts. We're shown a single continent's worth of kingdoms and creatures, rich and strange and lovingly detailed, but we're never given a clear sense of whether the same magical resurgence touched every surviving pocket of humanity equally, or whether some regions of the post-war Earth ended up considerably less transformed, closer to the bleak, magic starved farm world timeline we glimpsed earlier than to the vivid, candy colored ooh audiences spent 10 seasons inside. It's possible, and this is speculation rather than anything the show confirms, that the specific character of Ooh, its particular mixture of whimsy and ruin, says less about the planet as a whole after the war and more about the specific, localized effects of the mutagenic bomb landing exactly where it did. Other corners of the same broken Earth might have come out of the same catastrophe looking entirely different, harsher, stranger, or in some cases barely changed at all. The show never sends anyone far enough to confirm or deny that possibility, and so it remains exactly what it's always been, an open question resting quietly at the edge of a world that was never fully mapped to begin with. There's also the matter of how the show's various forms of currency and trade actually function across a world this fragmented, something easy to overlook entirely while watching, but strange once you stop to consider it directly. Kingdoms trade with one another, characters buy and sell goods, economies clearly exist in some recognizable form, and yet the show never establishes any consistent account of what backs this trade, whether some shared currency survived the collapse of the old world, or whether each kingdom simply operates its own separate economic system, loosely compatible enough with its neighbors to allow for trade, without anyone bothering to formalize the exchange rate. It's a small, almost invisible mystery, the kind that only surfaces if you happen to be the sort of person who notices these things, but it's there nonetheless. One more small, unfinished corner in a world built with this much careful, patient attention to everything except the parts that would have made it feel less like a place and more like a machine with all its gears exposed. Through every layer we walk down tonight, you've spent a long while in the dark with a cartoon about a boy and his dog, and I hope it gave you something close to what it gave me the first time I started noticing all of this, which is the particular, quiet pleasure of realizing a story trusted you enough to leave so much of itself unfinished on purpose. That trust is rarer than it should be. Most stories want to close every door behind you as you walk through the house. This one mostly just left them open and let you decide, each time, whether you wanted to look inside, because I think it's the thing actually worth carrying with you once the video ends and the room goes quiet again. A show that explains everything tends to feel smaller the longer you sit with it, because eventually you reach the edges of what it built and you can see the walls. A show that leaves enough of itself unexplained keeps feeling larger the longer you sit with it, because the edges never fully resolve into walls. You keep discovering, years after you first watched a given episode, that there was a thread in it you never noticed, a name dropped once and never explained, a room mentioned and never shown, a relationship implied and never spelled out. Adventure Time built itself this way, on purpose, or by some combination of purpose and the simple practical limits of how much story 10 seasons can actually contain. And either way, the result is a show that rewards exactly the kind of patient, repeated attention we've been giving it tonight. Every mystery we've walked through, the war nobody named a cause for, the mother who never got a single line of dialogue, the door lords who vanished after a single appearance, the dinosaur who only wanted to be good enough, the penguin who turned out to be the universe's oldest tired thing, all of it sits inside the same world. All of it touches all of the rest of it. Eventually, if you trace the threads far enough, and none of it needed to be fully solved in order to matter. That's the thing worth keeping. Not the specific answers, most of which don't exist and probably never will. The shape of a world built generously enough to hold its own permanent, unanswered questions without ever feeling incomplete because of them. because I don't think the value of cataloging a show's unresolved mysteries is really about the mysteries themselves. It's about what a show's relationship to its own gaps tells you about what it believed storytelling was for. Adventure Time could have closed every one of these doors. It had 10 seasons, multiple specials, a continuing spin off, comics, books, more runway than almost any animated show of its era to go back and tie off every loose thread it ever introduced. It chose, again and again, not to. It left Marceline's mother as pure, unfilled silence. It left the Mushroom War's actual political cause as something you have to assemble from broken signage and half-remembered television theme songs. It left Bubblegum's darkest infrastructure as an outline rather than a floor plan. It left BMO's nature as a question the show seemed to actively want left open forever. And in leaving all of that open, it built something that feels less like a story with an ending and more like a place, a real place, with the kind of permanent, uncatalogued mystery that real places actually have. You don't know everything about the town you grew up in, even after decades of living there. There are buildings whose full history you'll never learn, neighbors whose private griefs you'll never be told the full shape of events from before you were born that everyone alludes to but no one fully explains. Ooh has that same texture, deliberately, and I think that's the deepest reason the show has stayed with so many people the way it has. It didn't just tell you a story about a world. It built a world solid enough to contain things nobody, not even the writers, ever fully explained. The show ends the way it began, with a ukulele and 30 seconds of imperfect, deliberately unpolished sound, the same recording used in every single episode, from the first to the last, typing audible faintly in the background, if you know to listen for it. An accident the creator loved enough to keep permanent. That imperfection, that willingness to let something stay a little rough, a little unfinished, a little more honest than polished, is the same impulse that lets so many of the show's mysteries stay open. The show trusted its own texture more than it trusted the need for tidy completion. It trusted you to sit with not knowing, the same way it trusted you to sit with grief, with loneliness, with loss that doesn't resolve cleanly. Not knowing everything about O isn't a failure of the show. It's the most honest thing about it. If you've made it all the way down here with me tonight, through the Mushroom War and the Crown and the dinosaur who only ever wanted to be as good as the one who raised him, through Susan Strong's stolen decade of memory and the Doorlord species that never came back, and BMO's quiet, permanent refusal to be fully defined, then you've gone about as deep into this show's unanswered questions as anyone reasonably can right now. Some of these doors may open further someday, through some future comic or special nobody's announced yet. Most of them probably won't. Either way is fine. The mystery was never really the obstacle. The mystery was the point. If this kept you company tonight, it would mean a lot if you left a like before you drift off. And if you want more of these slow, late-night trips back into Ooh, consider subscribing. Because there's a lot more land left to walk through, a lot more ruins, still half buried in the grass, waiting for someone to notice them. There are characters we barely touched tonight who deserve their own full descent eventually, their own slow hour spent picking apart everything the show implied and never finished saying about them. And there's a real chance we come back here together and do exactly that before too long. For tonight, though, this is enough. Sleep well. The land of Ooh will keep, the way it always has, the way it always will, with the theme still playing somewhere on a ukulele in a cramped room you can almost hear if you listen closely enough. Good night.